Hello, and we recently published our last Who's Who of Watchmaking regarding the big groups of the industry, and so far we went over the Swatch Group, Richemont, LVMH, Kering, Hermes, the Parmigiani Group, and yes, I know there are still a few big players out there, but unfortunately, and despite the fact that we here at the Watchers TV, yeah, I know it sounds like if we were CNN or the BBC, well, we most certainly have the biggest and largest watchmaking video library compared to anyone else. Well, I nevertheless think that we don't have enough footage to produce sufficient qualitative video reports on these additional big groups, and I'm talking for instance Seiko and Citizen. In the future, I for sure hope we will be able to come back on these last ones, because Seiko is most definitely a very interesting and powerful player, and to talk about Credor, Grand Seiko and Seiko itself would be very interesting without any doubts. But to do so and to do things right, well, I guess we would need to go to Japan first. Well, who knows, it could actually happen, or actually I really hope it will happen, and at the same time we could go over Citizen, although they are already pretty present in Switzerland, being for instance the owners of Arnold & Son, La Joux-Perret and Frédéric Constant. And in terms of other big players, there is also China Hadian with Corum and Eterna, the Festina Group, the Movado Group, and the different but huge scale the Fossil Group. And we might not go over all of them, but no offense, okay? But you see, we are well aware of this. So today let's take this opportunity to make a little pause, because there are a couple of things I would like to ask you directly and do a small recap of what we've seen so far and highlight the main particularities of the groups mentioned in the intro. But quickly, before doing so, I just wanted to thank you so much for the feedback we've received so far on the episodes published. It means a lot to me, and it's seriously motivating for the future, because yes, there is a future, of course, to this series, and I would like to actually implicate you further with this. I saw that the level of interaction was absolutely astounding on one of our last videos regarding synthetic diamonds, and there was some really absolutely, great comments shared, discussed, just loved it. So this is the reason why I would love to have any input from you guys regarding the next episode of this Who's Who of Watchmaking series, because we will now start to dig by individual brands, go over their founders, their history, their uniqueness, their exploits, moments of glory, etc., etc. So if you have anything special that could help us or inspire us to do things better, well, now is the moment to share your thoughts. Really looking forward to that, and just wanted to mention that regarding these next episodes, we will ideally start with the big independent players of the industry, such as Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Breitling, and of course the crown itself, Rolex. But don't worry, we will also go over some smaller brands, whether independent or not, but naturally all the main brands that are within the groups that we already covered. So I know this will probably keep us busy for quite some time, reason why your input is more than welcome. So to summarize things, let's say that the groups we talked about are naturally all about selling watches. Yeah, that was big news. But the way they achieve this varies from one group to the other. They have different strategies, and in particular, they are organized differently to do this. You have to remember that this notion of group is rather fresh in perspective of this more than 200-year-old craft. At the time, and until fairly recently, brands represented the tip of the iceberg that was the visible part for the customer. But the watch this customer bought was made out of the addition and juxtaposition of components coming from many suppliers of the industry. This network of competencies, and I know this is something I drag often about in our various reports, but that's how the industry developed itself, allowing each and single player to develop the best capabilities depending on the needs of the final brand that required these components, whether for super high-end needs or for mass production. Well, this has changed quite a lot over the last 20 years, and it's in particular due to these power groups taking over the industry and all these illustrious brands. Well, the main consequence is the verticalization of the industry, meaning brands directly owning the resources and competencies to produce their watches. Furthermore, these groups also partly internalize their distribution, and some historic retailers have seen their business become more difficult, as some of the brands have become their direct competitor by opening monobrands boutique. Well, we live in an ever-changing world, and we see that these groups don't come with all the same answers to tackle this evolution. So to make things really simple and summarize, let's say that the Swatch Group has more of an industrial approach, and from the start their strategy was to master all the stages of the watchmaking process. This was done at a time when the industry had been smashed in the face with the quartz crisis, and this strategy is one that, simply put, saved the industry. If you only kept brands without the competencies to make the watches, well, you wouldn't have any watch or brands to talk about today. So the Swatch Group has a large portfolio of brands, but each brand belonged to a segment of the value proposition pyramid. And this pyramid is also very present in terms of how the group is managed. The Richemont Group has a different take on this, and they focus more on the acquisition of some super high-end names and kept the autonomy of each of these brands. With the new management structure today, well, they are now starting to pull further synergies between some of these brands, and it just makes sense. So for quite a while, I just didn't understand this initial strategy, apart if it was to be in a position of being able to sell each brand individually at a later stage. But I doubt this was ever what they wanted to do, because if you sell a brand, it's quite likely that it could be bought by one of your competitors, and you don't want to reinforce your competitor. So even if the brand is losing money, well, it might cost you more if you leave the opportunity to your competitor to be potentially successful with it, especially that the weight, the inertia, the prestige that the 150-year-old brand possesses and represent is something that will probably cost more to develop from scratch. Think of the number of power brands that developed themselves from zero within the last 20-30 years. Well, there definitely aren't that many, and especially in the segment of the very high luxury watches. And I'm not talking about the small and cool independent brands producing watches in the hundreds. So with LVMH brand, it's slightly different because to start up with, LVMH is just the most important luxury group throughout the luxury industry. So they can think slightly differently. And we can clearly observe that from their initial investment in watchmaking some 20 years ago, well, their strategy of how they handle this has really evolved. I guess that having put Mr. Jean-Claude Biver at the helm of the watchmaking division has had a big impact in the redefinition of how these brands work together and how they are positioned. But let's not forget that Bulgari is performing really well too. With Kering, things are a bit more complicated, and I'm not too sure their vision as a group is very well established, but again, their watchmaking activity represents quite a small portion of their overall activity. And this is in full contrast with the Swatch Group, where almost 100% of their activity is directly related to watchmaking, or solely related to watchmaking. So this is it for this small recap. I know that there are plenty of things that can be said about the strategy of these groups, and I will come back at a later stage on this, meaning the impact they have on one another. But I naturally clearly invite you to check each and single episode if you want more details on these groups, and I thought it was interesting to present you the Parmigiani group, even though we are really not talking the same scale as the group mentioned before, because it shows yet again another development strategy, same with Hermes. So anyhow, please don't hesitate to give us your input for this new round of Who's Who of Watchmaking, as we want to start exploring the history of the most important brands of the industry. So thank you very much for your time, thank you for your feedback, and see you real soon.